Hexas halted weapons for Ukraine despite military analysis that the aid wouldn't jeopardize U.S. readiness. The Trump administration has halted Patriots. They have halted artillery shell shipments, 155 millimeter artillery shells. They've halted some guided rockets and GMLRS systems. GMLRS rockets that are fired from MLRS systems. They've blocked a lot of mission critical aid for the Ukrainian armed forces and for Ukrainian air defense. And they didn't just block it, they blocked it as it was in Poland, getting ready to get shipped over the border. As it was getting ready to be moved over the border, some of it already in trucks. So that happened with zero warning to Kyiv, obviously upsetting many people in the country, many of the people that I've been talking to over the last 48 hours. And the explanation given as leaks started to come out that the Undersecretary of State Elbridge Colby was extremely influential in this decision, and that Pete Hegseth had actually tried to do this on multiple other occasions, but had been reversed. As that was coming out, with the only defense being, look, we're just too low in supply, and we have to do a review, and so this is necessary for a review. As they were giving that explanation that we were just so mission critical when it came to this supply, that the one nation state that needs this most desperately in our long list of allies, with the Iranians for the moment quite weakened and not in a position to go on any large scale air offensive through the medium to short term, and with the Taiwanese not currently in a state of war with the Chinese, the Ukrainians are the American ally that most desperately needs these air defense systems. And so for the United States to halt them, saying that we're at a situation where we just need them for ourselves, what it suggests is, well, the United States cannot produce enough air defense systems to protect itself and its allies. And if that is the case, that is a national security crisis. For us to be spending as much as we are, and for other nations to be spending as much as they are on American missiles, and for us not to have enough to send them to Ukraine, I mean, any supply, I mean, even just continuing the aid already approved by Congress. Mind you, this is not a new aid package. This is an aid package already approved by Congress. If that is true, then we're in a mission critical situation. But the problem is, NBC is reporting that Hegseth halted these weapons despite the fact that this might not actually be jeopardizing U.S. military readiness. And this isn't coming from some, oh, look, this is some piffy blogger or some disgruntled staffer. This is coming from the joint staff. This is coming from the armed forces. This is not coming from some journalist at WAPO or some opinion writer. The White House has defended the decision, saying it followed an ongoing review by the Defense Department of U.S. assistance to allies and partners abroad that began last month. The review began after Hegseth issued a memo ordering the Pentagon's joint staff to review stockpiles of all munitions, according to 3 officials familiar with the matter. The assessment found that some stockpiles of high-precision munitions are at lower levels, but not yet beyond critical minimums. The joint staff concluded that providing continued assistance to Ukraine would not drain U.S. supplies below a required threshold needed to ensure military readiness, the officials said. The Pentagon did not respond to a request for comment Thursday. Mind you, this is from NBC, the outlet that broke the story. They were the ones asking for comment. In Poland and other European countries, some of the U.S. weapons had already been loaded on the trucks, ready to be delivered to Kyiv to help its government fend off Russian missile attacks and hold the line against Russian forces in the country's east. Then military officers and officials handling the shipment got word that the delivery had been called off, said 2 sources with knowledge of the matter. Now, this was not sent to Kyiv in advance. Warning was not sent to anybody in Congress in advance, and so it ruffled a lot of feathers. It got a lot of people quite upset. So the Europeans, they were not happy. Of course, the Ukrainians were not happy, and not only, of course, were the Democrats not happy, but many Republicans who would have want to be at least informed of this, even if they wouldn't agree with the decision, were not happy. As well as the usual conflict with Congress saying they want to be informed of these types of national security decisions in advance before these decisions are made. A process complaint, a process complaint. But mind you, if we just stop Patriot shipments altogether, if we stop air defense shipments altogether, right now Europe cannot make up the difference. Some of the Russian missiles are just going to get through because the French, the Italians, the Germans, not everybody makes enough air defense systems to send over to Ukraine to make up the complete difference. That's not to say that they couldn't do more. That's not to say that there aren't other launchers in Europe that could be sent over, that there aren't more missiles in reserve, and that maybe if they were to send a lot, even from what their own defense departments would say is for them mission critical, that it couldn't have an impact now, especially since what are these air defense systems being positioned towards defending against in the future? Further Russian incursions. Right now, they cannot produce enough at scale to completely make up the difference. And many of these European countries are relying on American manufacturers to make up the difference. And in fact, when you read reports from Politico about where these future shipments of weapons are going to come from in order to make up this big 5% defense spending, 3.5% on, procurement and stuff for the armed forces itself, 1.5% in other fields, it's kind of like, magic dust to get to the 5%. But, it is all spending. Where is that money going to be spent? A decent portion of it's probably going to be spent in the United States, to the great pleasure of the American president, because big business deals for the United States, to the great pleasure of the American defense industry, which continues to benefit from the intelligence collected from the air defense being used in Ukraine against Russian missiles, being able to continue to evolve American air defense from that data. And now we are no longer giving these people who helped us evolve our systems to this point any more systems to either protect themselves, or for us even selfishly looking towards, not only our national security interests, but the fact that, our defense industry, quite frankly, got a lot of benefits from this when it comes to testing these in real-time scenarios against the exact missile systems they were designed to defend against. And they got big packages of support from Ukrainian aid packages that expanded their artillery production quite significantly in the United States. And now those shells are not going to be sent over. That was just a gift to them, that now they can send those shells wherever they want. They can sell it to whoever they want, possibly the Israelis, possibly other American partners, possibly other countries like Egypt or whoever, who knows? Because if it's not at a mission critical level, really, then maybe it will be sold to other nations. Or, as I've talked about before, possibly Trump will just have to be told, look, we'll buy it from you. If you're not going to have these aid packages come in, we'll buy it from you. Because maybe that, I'm very suspicious of the fact that part of the reason that this aid could be cut off is Trump might be wanting to use it now, whether or not this was the original plan, but this could be a plan that's retrofitted going forward, because I could see it, is Trump using this to say, look, we're not going to send you any more of these air defense systems until you pay. Which, on one hand, is wrong, considering that Congress passed aid. On the other hand, I think many people would just appreciate the clarity at this point, considering how much there's just been the flip-flopping and there's been so much dragging of the Ukrainians along. I wanted to just move on from this, because I don't want to talk about this too much, but Yaroslav, before we wrap this up, Yaroslav, who wrote the fantastic book, Our Enemies Will Vanish. It's one of the few full books I've actually read about the war. I don't read a ton of books about the war. I mostly have read books concerning either Ukrainian history or trying to figure out the language, struggling still, but moving forward. But he wrote a really good book about it, and I do recommend it. He wrote about the European need to invest in air defense. The Europeans are right to protest against Trump withholding air defense from Ukraine, but France and Italy in particular need a hard look in the mirror. Lockheed Martin invested in a new plant in 2022 and is more than doubling its output of Patriot PAC-3 systems missiles to 650 a year. The French, Italian, and British consortium of NBDA and Thales, which makes comparable Aster missiles for SAMP-T, probably produces fewer than 100 a year. That's an artisanal quantity, enough for 2 to 3 days of air defense in a war like Ukraine. And the thing that really scares me is that it feels right now that the only direct answer we've got to this is we'll spend more. But if we spend more on a national level and not on a co-national level, these nation states working together to buy in mass to try to integrate their defense systems together, and to try to not make it so, hey, these systems are going to be costing, millions more than they necessarily should. Because on the national level, with these different systems not being able to be produced at scale, and with these defense companies being able to charge much more for much less, you're going to get a lot less bang for your buck. And so if you invest 5% in your defense and you try to invest more in this, that's going to have some impact. But without going to an economy of scale, which the Russians have, you're going to have comparably less bang for your buck. If the Europeans spent no more, but had an economy of scale right now, there's a good chance that that would be on its face enough to deter Russia. Maybe not enough to reinforce Ukraine in all the ways that would be necessary, but I think it would be enough to deter Russia. But the problem is they don't. They have all these separate defense industries, which on their own have to compete. And they have their own defense establishments, which, quite frankly, when you talk about the business side of it, is quite happy with the state of affairs of producing much less for much more. So it's something that is going to have to be shaken up by the Europeans if they want to get serious about defense production and getting a bang for your buck, unless you want to spend ridiculous amounts of money that are going to have domestic political consequences if that money is being spent at the expense of pensioners or at the expense of public health care and at the expense of education or wherever they have to possibly make cuts in order to pay. If the European Union doesn't borrow together enough to make up the difference, either to reinforce the Ukrainians with further aid or to try to catch up. I would say that, though, if you're trying to do that on, a Danish model of helping to purchase procurement in Ukraine, where defense production costs are much lower, where you're going to get more bang for your buck in production, that might make more sense. But that's not being scaled up to the size that a lot of Ukraine supporters would want. Either way, though, the Europeans have a lot of defense procurement problems if they're going to be the ones that are left with the stick when it comes to Ukraine. So, Trump has a phone call with Putin after we hear about this aid cut. I'm nervous about it. Everybody seems to be nervous about it because they have no clue how it's going to go. Is Trump going to walk away from this saying, give another 2 more weeks, which he said multiple times to the failure of negotiations? Or is Trump going to say, you know what, now it's the time to take some action? Who knew? It could have been that Trump was told that, Putin had 3 riddles, and it could have been anything. But from what we were getting from Russian reports and American reports, Putin essentially said that he wants to keep going until the goals of the operation of the SMO, special military operation, are achieved, and that he is not willing to agree to a ceasefire. To make a long story short, there was also possibly some conversation about promoting traditional values in movies, according to the Russians, and a bunch of other kind of side conversations that seem just so strange considering the scale and violence of the war, when again they just continue to disrespect American pursuance of peace efforts. But Trump walked away from the meeting unhappy, at least publicly displaying unhappiness, saying that he is, and I quote, disappointed, and that this isn't the Putin that he knew.
for Russia and Ukraine. Are you still speaking? Are you speaking to Zelenskyy tomorrow? And what are you hoping?
I'm speaking to President Zelenskyy tomorrow, early in the morning, and yeah, I'm very disappointed with the conversation I had today with President Putin, because I don't think he's there. I don't think he's there, and I'm very disappointed. Well, it's not. I'm just saying, I don't think he's looking to stop. And that's too bad. This is Biden. This isn't me. This is Biden's war. It wouldn't have happened if I were president. It wouldn't have happened. So, you know, I in one way I had to get too involved because it's Biden's war. And I got stuck in the middle of it, just like I did with immigration and a lot of other things that they screwed up. But I was not happy with the conversation, no.
You know, this idea of, being disappointed makes sense. Putin change, oh, this isn't the Putin I knew. Oh, I can't believe the Putin that started the war is continuing the war. It just, on its face, it seems silly to the people who have been paying attention to the war day by day, just reading Russian press statement after Russian press statement after Russian state media interview after Putin speech after Putin speech from the start of the war to now. It's quite silly to be, oh gosh, how he has changed. How has he changed from the guy who invaded in 2022, 2014, invasions of Chechnya, Georgia? How has he changed from what? In what way exactly has he changed? But he's disappointed. This is not the Putin he knew. And then he shifts it over to Biden. Every diplomatic failure here is Biden's fault. It's Biden, it's Biden, it's Biden. If Trump was in office, he would have done something to get Putin to respect him and respect NATO and respect Ukraine and not invade. But now that he's in office, Putin won't respect NATO, won't respect Ukraine, and won't respect Trump's efforts towards ceasefires, even though he puts forward 2-week deadline after 2-week deadline after 2-week deadline after 30-day deadline after, ceasefire red line after 100-day deadline after a 24-hour deadline after, if you remember the Biden debates, before being inaugurated deadline. So at a certain point, after even if you were to say Biden could have done more to prevent the war by adding pressure to the Russians in some way, saying like, look, if you invade Ukraine, we will support them with air assets. We will support them in XYZ, maybe even a no-fly zone if you want to, upset a few of the people on the anti-interventionist side. Like, you could go in that angle and try to redraw that. But once you go out there and you say 24 hours, 24 hours, 24 hours, you've claimed ending the war. And now you've openly fingered Putin as the problem multiple times after Zelenskyy has agreed to every ceasefire. He has agreed to the 30-day ceasefire. He agreed to your mineral deal to pay back the aid that nobody said was now apparently a loan. So at what point do you bring action after the words? Because that's what he talked about on the campaign trail, but we're not seeing any of that. And at the same time, as this speaking to the press happened, at like literally the same time, right after he finished that phone call with Putin, that's when the air attack on Ukraine started. And it was the largest air attack of the war, another record-breaking air attack on Kyiv, which a lot of footage came from. I was in my apartment. I heard a lot of anti-air fire. I saw a lot of it outside of my window. I heard Brownings operating. I heard what I believe were Gepards operating, German Gepards, which are, anti-air systems. And I heard multiple impacts. Shaheeds were flying over apartments, and it was like that all night long. All night long.
Corrupt, bankrupt man.
I mean, trying to sleep through that really is difficult. And I think really the only reason I was able to sleep through some of it was because, to be frank, I remember some of the drone attacks when I was on the Dobropila area. I remember some of the bombing when I was still in Pokrovsk, and I was able to sleep through some of that. But it's still like a pit patter of sleep. It's like a nap followed by an interruption, followed by a nap. It was imagine trying to sleep through this, because with the 400 to 500 uh, pieces of drone equipment, long range attack drones that the Russians are reportedly making every month, people have to continue living life through this. This massive drones is meant to saturate the air defense systems, to be so overwhelming that the Ukrainians can just not shoot them all down. And we have seen them multiple times directly slam into Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, like this apartment building, like other apartment buildings during recent attacks, with zero interception. I talked about earlier when I was in Odessa, oh yes, the firing down of these shaheeds on the coastline could maybe hit a civilian building. That's true too. That is true. That's true everywhere. That's a risk that is going to be there, regardless if the attack is a war crime, regardless if they're targeting civilian infrastructure or not. Interceptions can be a danger for civilians. That's why there's things like red zones for air defense operators, where they don't fire in that direction due to the risk of intercepts hitting civilians, or even their own machine gun fire hitting civilians. But these are just slamming into apartment buildings. This just slammed into an apartment building. I saw another video a week ago that slammed into an apartment building. My fixer, Bogdan, it slammed into his apartment building 2 weeks ago while his grandmother was visiting. She came to visit back from Ireland for the first time, to see people, to hug family and stuff. And the night that she's there, the building gets hit by a shaheed. This is becoming much more frequent because Russian drone production is expanding, and they're working to continue to expand drone production as Russia is bringing in North Korean workers to work on these factories to expand production. And what are those North Korean workers going to do when they go back to North Korea with all that knowledge? That's something the Albert Colbys of the world should be thinking about. Here is a bomb shelter in Kyiv. There are a lot of them. One that people use pretty common is the metro station. If there's a basement, you can use that. But I know that a lot of people in my area use the metro. Very bad. There was this photograph taken of the city burning in the morning as the firefighters and rescue workers across the city were responding to the attack. Sesu. And the city was on fire. Smoke filled the sky. I was in a group chat with other journalists and fixers, and we were texting about the damage going on, and they could smell smoke. I could smell smoke. It was bad. And I actually saw that the Ukrainian Art History account reposted a painting by Ukrainian artist Taras Shevchenko of Fire on the Steppe that actually reminded a lot of people eerily of the fires in Kyiv. Taras Shevchenko being probably one of the, if not the most significant and well-recognizable Ukrainian and national figure, being a poet. Now, after this, mind you, this happened immediately after the Trump-Putin phone call. So Trump was told, we're going to continue the war. I don't want to do your ceasefire. And then he immediately bombs Kyiv in this massive way. The Ukrainian foreign minister points this out, directly signaling to the world Absolutely horrible and sleepless night in Kyiv, one of the worst so far. Hundreds of Russian drones and ballistic missiles rained down upon the Ukrainian capital right after Putin spoke with President Trump, and he did it on purpose. Enough of waiting. Putin clearly shows his complete disregard for the United States and everyone who has called for an end to the war. Moscow must be slapped with the toughest of sanctions without delay. Ukraine must be provided with all necessary means to defend itself. Wrong decisions can only encourage the aggressor to escalate terror. Every criminal regime in the world is now watching closely Putin's actions and responses to them. If he gets away with all of this, everyone will get a very clear message. Stop waiting for peace, act to achieve peace, peace through strength, calling over to Trump's campaign tagline. And they also posted about Chinese components to these drones. As there is a report that's circulating the media that the Chinese foreign minister told EU representatives that the Chinese government, Beijing, cannot afford Russia to lose the war in Ukraine. China Foreign Ministry Wang Yi reportedly told the EU's top diplomat, Kaja Kallas, on July 3rd that the country cannot afford for Russia to lose the war in Ukraine amid fears that the U.S. would shift focus towards Beijing, the South China Morning Post reported, citing sources familiar with the conversation. Of course, we're having to rely on SCMP, South China Morning Post, reporting here and their sources. As the war in Ukraine drags on, Wang's reported comments suggest that Russia's war in Ukraine may serve China's strategic needs as a focus has deviated away from Beijing's mounting preparation to launch its own possible invasion into Taiwan. The thing is, though, whether or not Europe and the United States are distracted, is like if the United States takes the strategy of let's just ignore this and concentrate on China, well, the Europeans can't. And if the United States wants to prevent a war in Asia, one big piece of leverage that could exist is the existence of European markets for Chinese production, the continuance of those consumers to buy up from that market. Because while China can probably deal with a trade war from the United States with pain, but survival, if that also includes Europe, an extremely wealthy consumerist continent, that'll be a little bit more difficult. That combined with a few Asian Pacific allies, if they wanted to coordinate, would put a lot of economic pressure on the Chinese and build as a bigger disincentive for them to invade Taiwan or start a general war. And I think that there's also similar economic incentives for the United States not to. But if the Europeans don't believe that the United States cares about its strategic interess and its main interest as well, we got to defend Europe. We got to defend the gates of Europe, the largest war in Europe since World War II. It's going to really tighten up their strategic flexibility there. So, like, no matter whether or not, like, Ukraine lasts another year, whether or not, did they immediately collapse, whether or not Ukraine wins the war outright, whether or not whatever outcome in your mind happens, the longer this war drags on, the better it is for the Chinese. And the more that the Europeans are distracted with this, the better it serves the Chinese with this viewpoint in mind. And it's not difficult to imagine them having that viewpoint, considering how much their economy has served the Russian war effort, not just taking advantage of the Russian energy export. Of course, they benefit as well from, being able to build up their drone production by being able to sell so many components. But this shows that whether or not, all these resources are shifted to Asia, the Chinese are probably not going to stop facilitating the Russian war effort. Being able to separate the Russians from the Chinese and from them balancing off each other is completely, it's a fool's errand. And so I think it would be smarter if you were to build pressure on the Russians so they could not drag out the war, and that they would have to either, make a deal of some reason, or that their war effort gets bogged down, they start facing setbacks, and the war goes in a direction that is so unfavorable to them that they have to see possibly even further compromise down the road. Either way, it's going to be a shorter outcome than the Ukrainians being undercut and the Russians being emboldened, thinking, well, now we've done the hard part, we waited them out. This was the hard part. This is the easy part. And under that strategy, if there was a war in Asia, Europe would be a little distracted. If America needed to, buy up some extra air defense systems, if America needed, European ship production, if America needed them just to stick out the economic neck, yeah, good luck. Good luck. North Korea also, we're hearing reports, we're going to talk about a American pivot to Asia. Let's talk about an Asian pivot to Ukraine. North Korea sending another 30,000 troops to Russia amid Russia's war against Ukraine. Whether or not these soldiers are going to be put on the border with Ukraine in order to try to stop a future Ukrainian incursion into Kursk or to Belgorod or into any of these areas, whether or not they're going to be deployed in Ukraine proper, and they're going to be used in offensive operations in the Donetsk region. I've seen some people trying to punch down on these soldiers, like, oh, wow, I guess more minuses for the Ukrainians to take. These soldiers fight ferociously from all the reports that I hear about, from all the testimony I've heard. They fight ferociously. They engage in large-scale mass infantry attacks, and it has, while taking a lot of casualties, these teams, they are also inflicting casualties. And when you have a manpower crisis on the Ukrainian side, these types of pressures do have an impact. And to a lot of the world and to a lot of Ukrainians, there's been a type of question of, well, who's being a better ally here, the North Koreans or the United States? Because the United States, you don't know what they're going to do any day of the week, even if they put a red line in the sand. They could say that this is the final line. I said we're going to build all this pressure, dual use goods are going to be cracked down upon. We're going to sanction, do secondary sanctions, and then none of it's pulled on. North Korea, they're sending their soldiers. North Korea, they're sending shells. North Korea, they're sending artillery systems. North Korea is getting Pantsers in response. North Korea is probably getting assistance to the shipbuilding program. North Korea is getting workers that'll be trained on Shahed production, long-range drones production. And that knowledge will be brought back to North Korea. This type of impact has meant that, not just the usual liberal critics and left-wing critics or Democrat Party critics or armchair critics like me and my big chair aren't just criticizing Trump for this. The New York Post. This is from the editorial board of the New York Post. Trump must reverse the dangerous Ukraine aid halt. The Pentagon's decision to pause aid to Ukraine is a massive blunder. President Donald Trump should reverse it ASAP. The White House confirmed Tuesday that to put America's interests first, the United States won't be sending promised and much-needed artillery rounds, Patriot air defense, rocket systems, Hellfire missiles, and other weapon systems to Kyiv. The excuse, a Pentagon assistant raised concerns that the United States' own weapon stores are running too low. By the way, I just want to throw this out there, we didn't need an estimation from the Joint Staff in order to know that part of this is nonsense. The guided munitions that was talked about as also being blocked, we do not have a shortage of those. Those guided munitions for GMLRS systems, there's no shortage. That everyone knows that. And when I say everyone knows that, I don't mean everybody on the street knows about the GLMRS systems. GLMN. I hate abbreviations. And I also hate the English language. And people want me to learn the Ukrainian language, for God's sakes. But these guided multiple launcher rocket systems and the munitions for them, if you're in the know, in the defense command in the United States, you know that there's no shortage. If you are somebody who is a Ukrainian official who monitors this carefully, or somebody who just, I guess, would, for whatever reason, want to be in the know when it comes to this, there's no shortage. So it can't be a lack of knowledge in Washington, D.C. of, well, I guess the GLMRS systems are also in short need. So why was that also included? Why was that included in the cuts? There's some stuff here that makes it feel more malicious, and which is why people are reacting to it so bitterly. This is also from the National Review. In cutting off Ukraine, Trump discredits the message he sent with the Iran strikes. And this one comes from the Washington Post, I believe. No, this wasn't the Washington Post. I believe this was the New York Times. Let me actually double check. I'm sorry. All the liberal outlets are basically the same. Have you ever, it's all MSM anyway, right, guys? It's all MSM. It was the Wall Street Journal. Okay, Wall Street Journal. Ukraine has already agreed to Mr. Trump's ceasefire terms, and the way to peace isn't to treat Ukraine as if it's equally as responsible for the war as Russia. The way to end the war faster is to impose tougher sanctions and arm Ukraine further, but Mr. Trump has imposed no pressure for peace on Mr. Putin's beyond plantative social media posts. The latest arms decision against Ukraine looks like another signal to Mr. Putin to continue the war. And why not? He can keep banking territorial gains while Mr. Trump keeps begging the dictator, pretty please, for a truce. Pretty please. This was also from the editorial board. Also from the editorial board, the Wall Street Journal. I mean, this is pretty bad. This is something that I always feared. And this is why Biden raced to try to send as much aid from the packages that were passed before Trump got inaugurated, because there was always the threat of a freeze. And this is the second freeze of aid. And again, Pete Hegseth considered freezes on 2 other occasions, but it was reversed, and he tried to go through with it, and he was stopped. So there was 2 freezes and 2 freezes that almost happened. And this is the second freeze. And as the second freeze goes into effect, Trump has a meeting with Putin, walks away from it, admits openly it's a diplomatic failure, then just blames Biden. And as he's blaming Biden and putting the war on him, Kyiv is being bombed. So Ukraine is not just waiting around for this state of affairs to continue, just holding out its cap, just hoping the United States says, well, I guess Europe's security interest to transatlantic relationship does matter for us. Well, now that they said 5%, now we're going to maybe entertain this more. And well, after Trump has tried diplomacy for like 170 days with the Russians, maybe we can take this in a different direction. The Ukrainians are trying to buy the weapons. We've talked about this before on the channel when the Ukrainians offered $15 billion to buy Patriot systems, but the Ukrainians are trying as many ways as they can to buy the weapons. And there's also some thinking being done in European capitals about European nations buying the weapons on Ukraine's behalf from the American defense industry, continuing to, benefit the American defense industry, as Europe also needs to invest in its domestic defense industry and take those weapons and give them to the Ukrainians as Trump is clamping down on these aid packages. Ukraine is striking out on getting the U.S. to send it more weapons, so it plans to try something new, asking Washington to let Europe purchase U.S. weapons for Ukraine, according to 6 people with knowledge of the request. The novel approach was being discussed around the time that Trump administration moved to halt some deliveries on military aid that had already been allocated for Kyiv, including Patriot air defense interceptors and highly explosive artillery rounds. The move, first reported by Politico on Tuesday, blindsided top Ukrainian officials. It also comes as Europe pledges to spend more on defense and is looking for creative ways to do so. One example of this is Zelenskyy met with an American defense corporation in Denmark to pursue joint drone production, and he bragged a lot about how this is going to help produce tons and tons and tons of drones in Ukraine. Of course, this is not a deal that is on its own game changing. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of drones being made, but it is just one example of the Zelenskyy government purchasing this equipment and directly paying them for these services instead of just waiting for the aid to come through. But again, if the Ukrainians come forward and offer the money, that does not mean that the Trump administration has to accept it. If they are saying that they're at critical levels, even though there's a decent chance they're not, that we're at critical levels, despite what the Joint Staff says, despite what other sources in the Pentagon say, despite other thing that's being reported, if we're at those levels, or they at least want to follow that line, then whether or not the Ukrainians want to purchase it, it's a question of our security interests over their security interests, which, of course, anybody in the American defense establishment is going to defend America's security interests over Ukraine's. So if they can say that these are contradictory, instead of just saying, well, we need to try diplomacy a little bit more, and so we're not going to, then maybe, because that in and of itself at this point would look like just a concession to the Russians. It would definitely, since the Russians said that they had to stop sending Ukraine aid in order for there to be peace, which basically that anybody in the know means, if you stop sending them aid, it'll be easier to conquer Ukraine. This is another way of getting there. Whether or not when you cut that aid is another way of getting to that Russian demand. And so Peskov was quite happy about it. But they won't be happy if it's replaced with a defense procurement, which the Ukrainians are trying to pursue, but are still getting only limited amounts of. Here is Zelenskyy talking about his call with Donald Trump, which came after the massive meeting with Vladimir Putin, which led to absolutely nothing, and which came on July 4th. Which, of course, Independence Day. Dear Ukrainians, a very brief update on today. It was a rocky start to the day, with more than 500 Russian attack drones and missiles. Difficult, but a significant number were shot down. Regrettably, some struck their targets. Interceptor drones demonstrated important performance today. Dozens of Shaheeds were taken down specifically by interceptors. We are scaling this up to the hilt, increasing production of such types of drones, the interceptor ones, and expanding training and preparation for our drone operators. The mission is clear. Today, I also spoke with President Trump. It was an important conversation. We agreed to arrange a meeting between our teams to strengthen air defense capabilities. We had an in-depth discussion about joint production, something both of us in the United States needs. Today also marks an important decision in Europe, in Denmark, our first agreement on weapons production. For us in Europe, cooperation between Ukraine and Denmark. This is paramount, both in security and investment. Okay, so he says the key thing that Zelenskyy says here is that Trump agreed to help Ukraine when it comes to procuring air defense capabilities. Now, whether that means he is going to reverse the decision and send over the Patriots, or whether that means some pursuance of the Danish model and Ukraine, maybe instead of just having, the United States pay some money to production on the ground, pay towards, factory production of interceptor drones or something. Maybe it is a example of the Ukrainians having to purchase themselves American equipment, and they'll be able to work with more, drone production, anti-drone production, or who knows. But they said to work towards air defense, to help strengthen air defense. Whether that's going to translate into the Danish model, whether that's going to translate into them removing the halt on the aid to allow the rest of the congressionally approved aid to go to Ukraine, whether that's going to mean defense procurement, we don't know, but it is a potentially positive sign from Zelenskyy. But considering, again, how many times these freezes have been on and then off and then on and then almost on, I honestly do not know where this is going to go. And I wanted to say one last thing. I wanted to point towards the bombing of American businesses in Ukraine, because there was a lot of locations that were hit in the massive attack on Kyiv. One example would be actually the Polish consulate building, which was hit. Nobody was injured, nobody was killed, but the Polish consulate building, a diplomatic building for the Polish government, was damaged in the attack on Ukraine. But also, American businesses are being damaged. American businesses are being burnt. American businesses are being bombed. And it was Donald Trump's strategy that was being used to confront Zelenskyy during an Oval Office meeting, saying, hey, you know, they would never go after you guys with this mineral deal. If we do this mineral deal and we have all these American businesses invested in Ukraine, then that will act as a disincentive. Maybe you don't even need NATO membership. And there's been all this theorizing about how much actual weight that would have. And I think most of it is being done by people who are, you know, I think maybe amateurists when it comes to the analysis, because all you have to do is go and look at how American businesses are being treated right now. Here is the president of American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine talking about how American businesses have been bombed and how other, you know, civilian businesses have been bombed. As Americans celebrate Independence Day, you know what? Actually, we could just listen to him directly.
Today is 4th of July here in Kyiv, and American business is being hit by Russia. We see that the 600 members of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Ukraine are being targeted by Russian missiles. We had a sleepless night here in Kyiv where 500 Russian aerial attacks on Ukraine, on central Kyiv, on American business here in Ukraine. We see that out of our 600 members, over 50% have suffered damage. That's why we call the US administration, the White House and President Trump to support American business here in Ukraine and to help provide Ukraine with the defense it needs. Ukraine is fighting together for freedom, for liberty, and for independence. And today, on the 4th of July, we all stand together. Thank you to all Americans for your support. Thank you to Ukraine for fighting for independence.
So, you know, giving his generalist, you know, his general support for Ukraine, you know, thank you for supporting Ukraine. But the underpinning strategy that was getting pitched after Trump said 24 hours was, we'll stop a future war by business investments. Trump's excuse for this tragic failure and loss of life, which is now at his feet after he went and tried to champion himself as a peacemaker, is that if he was president while Putin was suggesting invading and Putin then invaded, of course he wasn't openly suggesting invading, but all the evidence suggested he was going to invade, that Trump would have done something to stop it. Therefore, this is Biden's war. But if the only strategy that has been offered as a deterrence against the Russians that the United States has actually gotten any progress on, which is them making profits off of Ukrainian resources and having that you know, that interest that America has, that financial business interest, by it being American businesses on the ground, that it would stop a future Russian invasion. It's just not true. It's just not true. And so if that was the case now, why wouldn't that have been the case back in 2022 if that was Trump's big gambit, was announcing a big new investment program in Ukraine or whatever it would have been? Trump has not proved himself to be a peacemaker. Trump right now is the forever war president in Ukraine, not willing to take the actions to pressure the Russians to end the war, and not willing to do what is necessary to limit the most tragic impacts of the war as it continues. He is not only the forever war president, he is allowing the war to get worse. Let me look at chat for a second. Sup, folks? Hello, Mako. Carry potato, black-pilled kiwi.